Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Maddie here, and today we're going to be doing something that I'm actually kind of excited about. So, Shining Revelry has been out for about 4 weeks now, and I think at this point everybody is a little bit staled on the metagame. That typically happens. You know, to be fair, it's been a little while. We get new cards, new expansions about every month, and then when those cards come out, things get shaken up, and we have a lot to talk about and a lot to do. But for right now, we're kind of just waiting for that next set to release. A3, the next full set, which should be releasing here in really less than a week. In fact, I think the assumption is that the set will be releasing on the 30th. We don't know that for sure. I did expect the teaser trailer to come out today, but it didn't. So that basically means that it's probably going to come tomorrow on Thursday or on Friday. Either way, that news should be coming up pretty soon, which I'm really excited about. But again, I think at this point, everybody is a little bit, I don't want to say bored, but kind of just a little bit tired of the current metagame, which we've been sort of unraveling and figuring out over the last month or so. So in this video, I wanted to do something that I thought might be kind of fun and might be kind of interesting. And that is, we're going to be going back in time. We're going to be reminiscing. We're going to go back to the previous formats and take a look at all of the best decks from the previous metagames, from the previous expansions, and then we're going to talk about them, compare them to decks now, kind of talk about, you know, maybe could they see play in the future, could they not? It's just going to be somewhat pretty interesting. So right here on limitless.com in the metagame tab, we can actually do something that's really, really fun. And typically this isn't very useful, but it's something that for the purposes of this video is going to be definitely really interesting. So we can go here and we can see that we're in Pokemon Pocket, the standard format, and we can go ahead and select the set. Now this is basically selecting the metagame, the time frame of which we're going to be taking a look at the metadata and the deck lists. So right now, of course, we're in Shining Revelry, but let's go ahead and take a look all the way back as we see Shining Revelry, Triumphant Light, Spacetime Smackdown, Mythical Island, and Genetic Apex. We can go all the way back in time and take a look at the metagame and then take a look at the deck lists and just sort of dive right in. I'm actually pretty excited to go ahead and do this. So don't forget to like this video and subscribe and comment below your opinions on any of these old cards, old decks. Do you think that they could come back? Do you think that they might, make a return? Yeah, just let me know down in the comments. So let's go ahead, take a look at Genetic Apex. So if we think back to Genetic Apex, which was really the original format of Pokemon Pocket. This was back before we had any expansions. When the game released, we had those 3 booster packs. You know, we had things like Mewtwo, like Pikachu, like Charizard, Articuno, and all of those types of decks. And as we see, this was the metagame for this particular format, Genetic Apex. Mewtwo was by far the most played deck at a 24% meta share and a 51% win rate. We have Pikachu and Substrika, which I remember pretty fondly as probably one of the best decks. And then we also had Charizard and Moltres, and then we had a couple other ways to play Pikachu. We had Pikachu Raichu, Pikachu Electrode, we had Charizard with Arcanine, we had Starmie and Articuno. A lot of really, really fun deck lists here, but let's go ahead and take a look at some examples of top placing deck lists from this particular format. So this is old Mewtwo. If people don't, there might be some people who watch this video that don't remember or didn't play back then, or, you know, maybe you follow my videos and follow the metagame back then, but the original format was really interesting because there wasn't a lot of great cards. Mewtwo was definitely the best deck, and this was definitely sort of a mid-range sort of setup and sweep deck with Mewtwo and Gardevoir. Basically what we were able to do was attack turn after turn with Psy Drive because we had the Psy Shadow Gardevoir. Now, I've been thinking quite a little bit about this Gardevoir card because, to be fair, it's actually a pretty decent card, and then this is going to be the version of Mewtwo from Genetic Apex, but what we also saw was that Mewtwo saw a very big sort of uplift in Mythical Island. It got a ton of different support. So this is the original version of Mewtwo with Gardevoir, and this deck was really all about leading off with Mewtwo or with the small Mewtwo because, again, we didn't have things like Leaf to retreat. We didn't have, Red to do extra damage. We had a lot of limited options from a trainer perspective, and that's why we see Sabrina, Research, Giovanni, Pokeball, X-Speed, Potion, and Red card. We didn't have any other options. This is basically all of the trainer cards that we had at this time. But yeah, the strategy really was get Mewtwo set up, and we didn't have Giant Cape, we didn't have Rocky Helmet. So at this time, it was really just get Mewtwo set up, get our Gardevoir set up, and really the first player to be able to attack with Mewtwo, meaning technically the first player to get Psy Shadow Gardevoir up and running, meant that you could just take the first KO. We had no way to not get KO'd by Mewtwo, even if we were playing Mewtwo. There was really nothing in the game that had over 150 HP, other than things like Charizard, which if I remember, did kind of serve as sort of a top deck at the end of the format, as sort of a counterplay to Mewtwo and Gardevoir. But definitely really interesting. Again, this small Mewtwo was sort of put in place to be kind of act as kind of like a buffer. Like if Mewtwo EX wasn't the Pokemon we start with, at least we could lead with Mewtwo, the small Mewtwo, and then, you know, save sort of our Ralts and our Curly in the early game against things like Pikachu, because Pikachu really was the one threat. So Mewtwo at 120 HP was living an attack from Pikachu, which really was just there to kind of buy us a turn. So this is a very, very interesting situation here. But if we go back, like the other contending deck of this metagame was Pikachu and Zebstrika, which was actually really relevant, and I would actually consider this to maybe be the better deck of this format. If we go back, I mean, it had a higher win rate, it had less play and less results, but this was how people were playing Pikachu EX, and if we go back, Pikachu EX was probably like one of the best cards at that time, for sure, because Circle Circuit did 90 damage if we had a full bench, as a basic Pokemon for 2 energies, and this was really sort of that original tempo deck, and Pikachu was super consistent at that time, relatively speaking, and it was just really strong, because on turn 2, we could hit for 90 if we were going second. However, in this format at this time in the metagame, you really wanted to go second. There wasn't a lot of decks that benefited from going first, other than maybe things like Articuno, or maybe some Executor decks if they saw play, but Executor didn't see a lot of play, and even Articuno 18 Trainer, or with Sarmy and Misty, it didn't see as much play as these other competitive decks, mostly because Pikachu did well against it, but for the most part, it was reliant on getting those early Misties. So this Pikachu deck is really interesting. Like I said, there's a lot of cards in the metagame right now that would be better than the cards we were playing at this time. But I also think that Circle Circuit Pikachu is actually not a bad card. If we think about this card right now in the current metagame, we could do 90 damage on turn 2. Let's just say, like, this deck list right here, even if we weren't updating it with new cards, would have a good Gyarados matchup. And Pikachu was relevant into sort of Mythical Island because of Gyarados. Zebstrika was always it was kind of that original counter before we had some fighting card support, although I think in Mythical Island when we got Marshadow, Hitmonlee in the Marshadow package was sort of the direct counter to Gyarados, but Zebstrika at the time was really good. You could also kind of, you know, KO or get some early chip damage on something like, you know, your opponent's Mewtwo, so that then you could bring in Pikachu and take the KO. So it was really interesting, but this Pikachu also, I think, is still a fairly decent card. I think the only downside to Pikachu, and then another card which we're going to probably talk about in a little bit, is that it just has such low HP. Like 120 is extremely low for an EX Pokemon, especially in the format right now. Basically every basic EX Pokemon that sees play has either 140 or 150 HP, because even with Giant Cape, there's so many Pokemon that are able to KO you now with Red that if you're an EX Pokemon, it doesn't matter if you're a basic, you basically have to have 140 or 150 HP to at least have the potential to live an attack from like just an attacking Pokemon in the format right now. So Pikachu's not that bad. Like 90 damage on turn 2 and every turn after that is certainly really consistent. The issue is that Pikachu right now in this format wouldn't be able to do well because things like Giratina and Darkrai are able to set up 2 Pokemon at the same time. So like even if we are able to outpace, you know, like our opponent playing Giratina Darkrai, they're going to have like that second Darkrai or that second Giratina that's being set up at the same time to just KO Pikachu. And then once that happens, because we don't have the ability to one-hit KO them other than maybe like flipping heads and getting lucky with Zapdos, we just don't really have the ability to do that. So that's, I think, a big reason why Pikachu EX, the old Pikachu, isn't really relevant in the format right now. And the new Pikachu EX also, I think, has 120 HP, but it does 150. So I think that the new Pikachu has potential as sort of a late game kind of finishing attacking option, but this Pikachu here, an early game attacker, really good pace on it, but just not enough HP, and there's just not enough really like good enough partner Pokemon to pair with this Pikachu to make it relevant. The other downside to this card right now is that because we need our bench full of electric Pokemon, it really limits the way that we can build the deck. We have to include a lot of Pokemon. Most decks right now are playing little amounts of Pokemon and tons of the useful trainer cards. This deck is definitely a little bit, you know, kind of handcuffed in that sense, where you have to run a lot of electric Pokemon to fill the bench out. And then Zapdos. Zapdos is not a good card, like by any measure. It even wasn't that good back in the day, but it technically back then gave you the ability to, hey, like I'm going to flip 4 coins. Maybe we flip 3 heads and we just KO your Mewtwo and then we win the game. So I remember that happening like in tournament finals of Ursa days back in the day, but Zapdos was never really a really consistent card, and in this format right now, Zapdos is absolutely pretty terrible, unless we had a way to basically alter like the probability of the coin flips. Like on average, doing basically 100 damage for 3 energies is not good. It's not a good card whatsoever. Pincurchin, this was here basically to stall, to do extra chip damage. Like if we had to, we could technically like paralyze our opponent a couple times in a row, and it was also a win condition. But yeah, Zebstrika was interestingly the #1 partner with Pikachu. And then if we go back as well, the other way that people were playing Pikachu was with Raichu, and this was actually my favorite way to play it back in the day. We're going to get out of Genetic Apex in a minute, but it's just fun to reminisce. So this deck was actually fairly good. This was Lieutenant Surge with Thunderbolt Raichu, which to the standards of the game right now, this is actually a pretty strong card. 140 damage for 3 energies, but you discard all of those energies. So at the time, like with Giovanni, we could technically do 150 with Raichu, but also, like I said, just kind of finishing KOs on anything in the game. We could KO like a Moltres or like an Articuno. There's a lot of things that this Raichu was good at, but interestingly enough, this was not the most played version of it. This was, in my mind, my favorite way to play Pikachu back in the day. But again, we were still playing, you know, 2 Pikachu, 2 Raichu, Zapdos, Pincurchin, very similar to how we were playing the Zebstrika variant, except now we were able to slot in Lieutenant Surge and just have a really strong attacking option on the back line. Yeah, that's what the format was back in the day. And then we did have Charizard, like old Charizard. I'm not even going to talk too much about Charizard because it really hasn't changed a whole lot. Like Charizard is still Charizard, if that's like funny to you guys, because well, now this list was playing the small Charizard, which I don't really remember that ever happening, to be honest, but the Charizard strategy has always been the same because Charizard's 200 damage is still relevant to this day. You just go into Moltres and you hope that you get your Charizard set up with 5 energies by, you know, turn 3 or 4. And then even in today's, by today's standards, Charizard still is a fairly played deck and the strategy is almost the exact same. Nowadays we have things like Iono and Pokemon communications, but very, very funny that Charizard really hasn't changed much at all. And that was the metagame from Genetic Apex. And then we can, I guess, take a look at like Articuno and Starmie because this deck didn't see nearly as much play, but back in the day, this was basically just sort of like high roll Misty coin flip deck where you could Blizzard turn 2 or turn 1 sometimes. Like the deck just sort of did what it did. But because Pikachu was so relevant and our entire deck list was weak to Electric, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense for us to play a deck list like this because there was just a lot of ways that our opponent can kind of KO us, and Pikachu again was like really popular. So yeah, anyway, that's Genetic Apex, and you know, I have pretty fond memories. This was when I started to make Pokemon Pocket videos, and I remember making data-driven videos even about like this super simple format back in the day where I kind of took Pikachu, Charizard, and Mewtwo, and I sort of analyzed all of the matchup data, and I really tried to find some interesting correlations between all of those decks. But I think most people remember that Mewtwo was sort of the deck back in the day, but as we see, Pikachu definitely won a lot and had probably the highest win rate out of any deck, which is definitely very interesting. And back then, I think consistency was king, but you know, like I said, the format was much more simpler back then. And then, if we remember, Mythical Island came out, and Mythical Island was a big deal. This was actually 6 weeks after the game's release, so we had a long time of Genetic Apex, and the game was fairly stale, if I'm being honest with you. But at that time, you know, Mythical Island came out, and then bang, we had so many new cards that were so good, and I think we can see that immediately. So this was the set that we got Celebi, we had Jungle Totem Superior, and we had Gyarados. And we also had some other strange things. I believe we had like the new Golem, Aerodactyl EX came out around this time, Scolipede came out with Weezing, so there was other options. But one of the other big things that came out at this time, and we're going to take a look at the deck list, was the inclusion of, for some reason, a ton of Psychic type support in the form of Mew EX and also Mythical Slab. Now, this version of Mewtwo and Gardevoir is not running Mew EX. Let me go and actually, can we get a Mew EX version of this deck? I want to check here. Let's see. What about this one? Yeah, okay. So this is a version running Mew EX. So at this time, we had a lot of cards that were included into the game in Mythical Island that just made Mewtwo a lot better. And for some reason, I don't know why they chose to do this. Mewtwo was the most played deck and was the best deck in Genetic Apex. And then it became even better for some reason in Mythical Island. They gave us Mythical Slab, which is a card that doesn't see play anymore. But again, at that time, before we had Pokemon communications and before we had a lot of really strong decks that didn't require a lot of Pokemon, the Mewtwo strategy was running a lot of Psychic Pokemon. And this was the best way to play it. So Mythical Slab, even though this card doesn't see play anymore, is actually a really good card in decks that are running a lot of different Psychic Pokemon. And again, at this time, the Mewtwo deck was just running a ton of Psychic Pokemon. We had the Ralts, Kirlia, Gardevoir, Mewtwo lineup now, and then we also had Mew EX, which was a secondary attacking option that was very good against Charizard. It was kind of a card that took Charizard out of the metagame, but it was really good in the mirror match as well. Mew has seen some play. It hasn't really seen play this format. It saw play last format in Arceus and Dialga, but Mew EX is still a really relevant card. I just don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to be playing it right now in the metagame. But Genome Hacking could copy Mewtwo EX's attack for only 3 energies, which was really relevant. It could also hit for 150. And then, like I said, you're going to see Blue here. So if you remember Blue was really relevant of it in the mirror match, and also Leaf. Like, we had a ton of great cards come out in the set. Leaf to increase our, or reduce our retreat cost by 2, Mythical Slab as well to find psychic Pokemon. We had Blue, we had a lot of strong Pokemon, but Blue was really good in the Mewtwo mirror match, and this was a card that was included a little bit later on, but it basically allowed you to KO your opponent and then play Blue on that turn, and then they had no way to do 160 damage to you unless they had Giovanni. So most people were just playing Blue instead of Giovanni because you didn't actually need it other than like to counter Blue. So most people just played Blue. And again, it really just became a race of like who had the cards first. So Blue was really interesting, but this Mewtwo deck was absolutely insane. This is what I really remember about Mewtwo, was after Mythical Island came out with Mew EX and Mythical Slab, this deck was just an absolute monster. And as we see here, 18% of the metagame and only a 50.5% win rate, which is pretty interesting. But the next most played deck is Gyarados. And what's funny to mention here is that Gyarados was a deck that did not do well against Pikachu and Substrika, but it still was the #2 most played deck. And let's take a look at an old Gyarados deck, because this is such a throwback to me. When Gyarados came out, people initially thought this card was not good. They took a look at the attack. They were like, okay, this thing takes 4 energies to attack, and it does 140 damage. It's just not that good because we have to discard a random energy after we attack. For some reason, people looked at Gyarados, and you might think you're wrong, but again, when this set came out, that overall consensus early on was that Celebi was the #1 card, and it was with Jungle Totem, and that's what everybody thought would be the best deck, and as we saw, it definitely did not turn out that way. But Gyarados here with Raging Whirlpool was extremely good, and now we did not have Manaphy at this time. So no Manaphy, no Origin Form Palkia. Really all we had was Druddigon, which came out of Mythical Island, which was a massive deal. Druddigon was a card that was super, super good, especially in a format that was heavily dominated by things like Pikachu. Druddigon was able to live an attack from Pikachu while also doing some very valuable chip damage. Greninja here with Water Shuriken fixed the math with Gyarados, meaning that in one turn we could Water Shuriken and then attack with Gyarados and hit for 160, which was enough to KO both things like Charizard at 180 HP with weakness, but also Mewtwo, right? Even with Blue had effectively 160 HP. So Gyarados at the time, even when it was released, was probably the strongest deck in the game. It lacked a little bit of consistency, but again, we did have Leaf to get Druddigon under the active spot. We still had Misty's Research and Pokeball. A very, very simple deck list here, but a list that was extremely strong back in the day. And still, I mean, to this day, Gyarados has had a very firm grip on the metagame. For some reason, since Gyarados was released in Mythical Island, we've gotten things like Palkia EX, we've gotten Manaphy, we had Washout Vaporeon, we have Irida. There's so many things that have made Gyarados even better since it was released, but even at this time, it was probably the strongest deck, if not one of the strongest decks of this metagame. So definitely really interesting. But like I said, early on, people weren't really high on Gyarados. It became the most played and the most dominant deck later on. But early on, it was really Celebi and Superior that a lot of people were playing. And I think this was kind of a meme. I think a lot of people saw, images and videos of Celebi hitting for 600 damage, and they just figured that the card was insane. And to be fair, it was really, really strong. But back in the day, you kind of needed Jungle Totem, Superior to get set up so that the, coin flips were doubled with Celebi, and even then it was a bit RNG. We all saw those funny videos of Celebi flipping 12 coins and only like flipping 2 and not taking the KO. It was really, really funny, but the big issue with Celebi, I think for the most part, was that it just got revenge KO'd. And even in this format, that was a big deal because at 130 HP, we did not have Giant Cape. So realistically, what we had to do, the only way this deck was able to win was to lead off with Exeggutor, take at least 1 KO, and then have our Celebi set up on the back line so that we could take the last KO against really anything our opponent had. And again, it wasn't that consistent of a strategy, but Celebi definitely was one of the strongest cards in the game. The deck list overall just lacked a lot of consistency, and again, I don't believe we had Pokemon communications at this time, so running all of these Pokemon made it just a little bit awkward. And I think what we're gonna actually see, maybe in this format or the next format, was it this list here? Let's take a look. No, this is a very similar option. So very similar deck list, but instead of playing like 1 copy of Execute and Exeggutor, they were playing 2 copies. This was around the time that I think people realized that Exeggutor was really the MVP of the set. And back then, like, decks weren't able, we didn't have Giratina or anything like that. So we didn't have like decks that were able to set up 2 Pokemon at the same time. So you kind of had to utilize something like an Exeggutor, which was really strong in the early game. but only had 1 energy in its attack cost, meaning like after we attach that first energy to Exeggutor, we could then just start piling our energy on the second Pokemon. Nowadays, like that strategy doesn't even make a lot of sense because we can set up both like a Darkrai and a Giratina at the same time, and they're both like stronger than Exeggutor and Celebi. So there's been definitely a little bit of power creep, but at that time, that was really the strategy. And then maybe we also get Jungle Totem set up. So instead of flipping like 3 or 4 coins with Celebi, we were flipping, 6 or 8, which was definitely really strong, but also a deck that lacked a little bit of consistency, I'm not going to lie. But yeah, I do remember pretty fondly that, Celebi was by far the most hyped up deck. And as we see here with Exeggutor, it actually did have the highest win rate, but it was the 5th most played deck. This format was really all about Mewtwo, upgraded Mewtwo, and then Gyarados running away with it, but because Gyarados was very, very strong, we had to play Pikachu and Substrike it to kind of counteract Gyarados, but even then it was just such a strong deck. So this format was definitely a little bit more opened up, right? We had some other inclusions. We had a new water-type deck that was really strong. Charizard was still kind of floating around a little bit, but Celebi was also a major player. So we had really like 3 or 4, maybe 5 decks in the format right now that were relevant, and if we go down, there was some other decks at that time that were pretty good. Aggro fighting with Aerodactyl was pretty relevant. We had like the Mew EX Greninja deck. I don't know, did we get Tauros at this time? Was this when we had Tauros? I don't remember. Maybe not. Maybe we didn't get Tauros in Mythical Island. I can't actually remember here. Either way, it's not in the deck lists, but yeah, definitely interesting. And Scolipede, I remember too, was a big deal because this was kind of a direct counter to Mewtwo, but it lost to basically every other deck in the game. So Scolipede Weezing was a deck that saw a little bit of play. It saw some shine early on. Again, extremely strong. Oh yeah, there's Tauros. So we did get Tauros in Mythical Island. I was always really high on Tauros. I thought Tauros was an incredible card. It does I think 100 or 120 to EX Pokemon for 3 colorless energies, which is honestly pretty relevant. I think Tauros is actually a good card even still, even though it only has 100 HP. But yeah, Scolipede with Weezing was able to absolutely body Mewtwo's, but it just lost against like other things like Pikachu and, the Celebi decks and of course Gyarados. So it didn't see as much play, but it was definitely really, really fun to play Scolipede and counter those Mewtwo decks back in the day. So yeah, that's the Mythical Island format, which I honestly remember extremely fondly. It was one of my favorite formats to play. And then now we're going to go back into a time that probably we all remember a little bit more closely because it wasn't that long ago, which is Spacetime Smackdown. And I think a lot of people remember Spacetime Smackdown the way that they remembered the Triumphant Light metagame, but they were actually different. If you remember when Spacetime Smackdown came out, we had Palkia, we had Darkrai, we had Magnezone came out, we had, Palkia, Dialga, Darkrai, Weavile, Magnezone, Skarmory. Like there was a lot of really good decks, but what was funny to me was that even though we had so many incredibly good new cards that were released, Pachirisu, Yanmega, so much stuff in the format that came out was really, really good in the set. But what ended up being the #1 deck by a wide margin was Exeggutor with Celebi. And again, this was back when people realized that Jungle Totem just wasn't really necessary. Exeggutor was sort of the card that carried us. This was when we got tool cards, and the tool cards definitely changed the metagame quite a bit. We had Cyrus now, and on top of Sabrina, which definitely made Exeggutor that much better. Giant Cape brought Exeggutor to 180. We had Ericas, we had Potions. This list was absolutely dominant in Spacetime Smackdown in this format because there just wasn't a lot that people could do with 180 HP Exeggutor, doing 40 to 80 damage every turn, setting up the Celebi on the back line, and people just realized that we don't need Jungle Totem. Let's just consistently go into Exeggutor. We had Pokemon Communications at this time, and it's so funny to me because this is only a couple of months ago, but the game was so different. This was before we had Giratina in the game, before we had Red. So many things have changed. Exeggutor was so good because, again, no other deck, like there wasn't any ability to like ramp up super consistently. Like you could only set up one Pokemon at the same time. So against any kind of ramp deck that wanted to set up like a Gyarados or a Charizard or even a Mewtwo, you had to deal with this Exeggutor that was probably just going to start smacking you from turn 1. And then even if you did deal with the Exeggutor, which was very difficult with Giant Cape and Ericas, then you had to go into a Celebi that was probably flipping 4 or 5 coins, and it was probably just going to KO you. So it was a really, really dominant deck list, and it's just so funny to me that if we look back to Spacetime Smackdown, that Exeggutor Celebi actually was that really, really strong deck list. Now, the other one that people probably remember were the early Darkrai decks with Magnezone and Greninja. Gyarados still floating around here, Palkia still floating around, Magnezone and Skarmory was a really great aggro option back in the day, and then we also had Fighting Magnezone. So this format was definitely fun, but let's take a look here because I do remember Darkrai and Magnezone seeing a ton of play, and people were really, really mad about this list. I think it played Druddigon early on, but then people kind of swapped from Druddigon onto Kangaskhan later on in the format. which I think probably made a little bit more sense because it only needed 1 energy and it was just a little bit more less passive, especially against opposing Dredagon decks. So a lot of people also would just choose not to attack Dredagon, I remember. But yes, so this was like the deck that I think people hated more than anything, because Darkrai Magnezone was really, really good, right? We led off with Kangaskhan, we just started Dizzy Punching, we were doing some chip damage with Darkrai, and then Magnezone was getting set up on the back line. And sometimes what would happen was, because Kangaskhan had so much HP, that you'd have to go through Kangaskhan, and then by the time you did go through Kangaskhan, you'd have to go through Magnezone, and then once you went through your Magnezone, you had to also go through Darkrai. And it was a very annoying line, and a very punishing deck for decks that just weren't able to sort of overcome a deck like this that was, you know, at that time, probably a little bit more consistent than it ever had any business being, but very funny in a very interesting deck list. These are very significant memories that I'm sort of unlocking in my brain. The other deck that was really good was just Greninja with Darkrai, so this deck played Dredagon for sure, and this was kind of like, I think at the time where people just realized that the Dredagon Greninja package was just extremely good in general. In fact, we still see this particular deck in this package doing well because it's just so strong and so much passive damage as far as like slower ramp decks go. The Rough Skin damage, the Nightmare Aura damage, the Water Shuriken damage, just so much damage modifiers. Of course, Cyrus being really good in this deck as well. This is a list and a strategy that's actually still relevant to this day, which is pretty funny. One thing I remember actually was, yeah, let's go. So yeah, so Darkrai Greninja was just better than Gyarados and Greninja, to be honest with you, at this time, because we didn't have red, and Gyarados kind of just struggled in a lot of scenarios. I think we had Manaphy in the set, but Manaphy didn't see that much play. Yeah, so this was when we had Manaphy, but what you'll notice about this Manaphy deck was that it was playing Palkia, Articuno, Washed Up, Vaporeon. This was a strategy that was very high roll, but the main issue with Manaphy during the time of Space-Time Smackdown was that we did not have Origin Form Palkia, which means we didn't have like a buffer. Like once Manaphy got KO'd, you kind of had to go into your Palkia EX or your Articuno EX, even at that time if you're playing Gyarados, into your Gyarados EX. We didn't have like an Origin Form Palkia, which acted as sort of that middle buffer that I think in my mind has really made Gyarados extremely strong right now. Gyarados is also probably just a better card than Articuno and Palkia in several different ways, but the main idea with this deck list was that, you know, we just dump a bunch of energies with Manaphy, maybe hit some Misties, and then hopefully we had Washout Vaporeon active, and then we could kind of like go in Dimensional Storm and then move those energies from other Pokemon in Dimensional Storm back to back, which was not a bad strategy, but the deck was just a little bit awkward in nature, and like I said, if Palkia did go down, the game was over. So definitely an interesting deck list here. But like I said, the Manaphy decks really never popped off until Triumphant Light, until we got Origin Form Palkia, which again is a really important card of that matchup, because you can go Manaphy into Origin Form Palkia into Gyarados like we do right now, and that's, I think, a massive reason why that deck is so good. But anyway, yeah, this was the Space-Time Smackdown format, something that I think a lot of people probably have either suppressed or just probably forgot about. And I think a main reason for that is because, like, Triumphant Light really changed the metagame, but it came out, I think, like only 3 weeks after Space-Time Smackdown or something like that. It definitely was a very short time frame. And I think we all remember the Triumphant Light metagame. It was the last meta before the one that we're in right now, so it was, you know, a month, 2 months ago. But let's quickly take a look at it, because Triumphant Light was, in my mind, the worst metagame that we've had so far. That's just my opinion. Triumphant Light was very annoying for just basically several different reasons, and that was Dialga and Arceus EX. Just so annoying. This deck list was so much better than every other deck in the game. And again, a main reason for that was that we didn't have red, we did not have things like Giratina, so decks like this, like Dialga decks, were extremely good because now we had a great partner in it with Arceus. And this is a list that quickly fell off in Shatting Revelry, of course, mainly because Giratina came out and Giratina was just much better, and because you could set up both a Giratina and Mewtwo at the same time, or Giratina and Darkrai at the same time, and that was just in general a lot better than Dialga, you know, not getting set up and not being very valuable, and then only setting up like one Pokemon after that. So they could kind of just chill on the back line and then set up 2 Pokemon at once, KO your Dialga and then KO your Arceus, right? So Dialga Arceus was very good before Giratina came out, because again, up until Giratina EX came out, really the only strategy was to like set up one Pokemon and then sweep your opponent that way. And Dialga and Arceus was probably the best way to do that. Arceus could hit for 130 with Giovanni, That was 140. With Giant Cape, with Rocky Helmets on Dialga, like we were doing enough damage to sort of sweep our opponent. We also had Mewiax for some matchups like Mewtwo or I guess like Charizard. So it was a very interesting deck list. Like 2 potions and Shaman could keep Dialga up for a long time, especially against the Darkrai deck. So this deck was absolutely incredible. Probably just one of the strongest decks of all time relative to its time period in this format. And the main issue with this format, if we think back, because it really wasn't that long ago, was that Dialga Arceus beat basically every card in the format other than this Rampardos deck, which was like literally the only counterplay option to Arceus and Dialga. So the format basically turned it, and this is a deck that also sees play still right now, a totally relevant deck list even in the format right now. But at the time, this was really the only strong deck that was good against Dialga Arceus, which really like limited our ability to play anything other than either Dialga Arceus, which was the best deck in the format, or the only deck that could really counter Dialga Arceus. So the entire format really felt like it was just those 2 decks, and really these were the only 2 decks that won week after week after week. So shout out to Rampardos for somewhat saving last format, but unfortunately things were very much skewed. We had 18 Trainer Articuno, which actually was definitely really good, and then we had Leafeon and Celebi. I know some people really wanted Leafeon to be good and Celebi to still be good, but it just wasn't. Terrible win rate amongst all of the other top decks. But as we see, like the meta shares dropped off significantly. Even Darkrai Magnezone, Weavile Darkrai, Origin Form Palkia and Palkia Gallade. These are decks that barely saw any play. 3% to 2% of the metagame. Extremely small sample size. 20%, really 30% of the metagame were playing Dialga Arceus, and then either a counter to it in Rampardos or Gallade. So interesting for sure, but this was the Triumphant Light metagame. And then, of course, as we've seen right now, and of course we're not going to go through it, but Shining Revelry, which really was the time period where Giratina and Darkrai has taken over. Giratina is really the MVP. I mean, if we go back, like certain cards really define formats. For me, this format was definitely defined by Giratina, but the other card that sort of defined this format was Meowscarada, which it really hasn't done as much as maybe we would like, but has definitely been a pretty defining card in this metagame for sure. If we go back here, so Triumphant Light was all about Arceus. Arceus was by far the strongest card and was absolutely just dominant, but also Rampardos was really good as well. So shout out to Rampardos. And then Spacetime Smackdown, again, interestingly enough, like Darkrai and Magnezone were, I think, probably the most influential new cards to come out in the set, but the set was definitely heavily dominated by Executor and Celebi, which is pretty funny if we kind of think back. But Magnezone was really, really relevant. Skarmory was pretty relevant, and then Weavile and Darkrai. Definitely Darkrai was a massive deal in this format, but as we see, Executor and Celebi kind of ran the show here. Mythical Island, all about Mewiax and Gyarados, but also Celebi and Jungle Totem. Mythical Island had a ton of incredible cards. If we go back, there really wasn't, and Druddigon as well, like Mythical Slab, we had Leaf. There was so much stuff that came out in Mythical Island that really changed the game. It was probably one of the craziest times to be playing Pokemon Pocket for sure. And then we have Genetic Apex, which we all remember was all about Mewtwo and Pikachu, and then somewhat, Articuno and Misty and Charizard. So yeah, anyway, guys, that's our trip down memory lane. These are all of the forgotten deck lists, the forgotten strategies, the forgotten metagames that I kind of wanted to talk about in this video. Like I said, hopefully this was somewhat interesting to you guys. I don't think that many of the cards that saw play previously will have that much of an opportunity to see play in the future. It kind of, to me, seems like we are power creeping at a pretty tremendous rate. Now, I think that the cards that came out in the last set, in this set at least, are all good. Like Palkia is good, Arceus is good, Dialga is good, Giratina is good. I think Mewtwo's still fine. Darkrai, of course, is good, and Gyarados is good. But I think if we really go back and we take a look at like Pikachu or even things like Articuno have really kind of fallen out of favor. So it's going to be tough to see some of those older cards come back into relevancy. But again, we'll have to see. You never really know. And I'm really excited to see what comes out in A3, the third full set of Pokemon Pocket. I think it's going to be really, really fun. Like I said, stay tuned because that set should be announcing here in the next day or two, which of course we're going to cover everything on the channel. And then once the set does release, you're going to want to stay tuned for everything that we have to talk about when the new cards come out. But anyway, guys, hopefully this video was somewhat interesting to you guys. Like I said, the format's just sort of come to an end now. I think we all understand what's going on. So I kind of just wanted to make a video reminiscing, going back and just sort of, enjoying, looking at sort of what things used to be and what's changed. Having that perspective is definitely pretty interesting. But I would love to hear your guys' opinions down in the comment section below. Let me know if this video was interesting to you guys. And like I said, the game hasn't been out that long, but there's a lot that's changed over the last 4 or 5 months. So I'm really, really excited to see how things change further in this new expansion, which should be coming out in a couple of days. So yeah, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Peace out, guys. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah, bye.